included parts of Colorado, parts of Texas, parts of California, going right up to La Plata in Canada. This civilization known as Olmec was to touch all other civilizations in America, the Maya, the Toltec, the Aztec, etc. It was even to stretch right out into South America. What is very unusual about this civilization was that not only was it the mother of American civilizations, but it contained elements that were not just native to America, but was a fusion between the Native American and people coming from outside. The most significant of those outsiders were the Africans. We have very clear evidence in stone heads, in terracottas that are clay sculptures, as well as skulls and skeletons of an African physical type entering that native population, somewhere between 948 and 680 BC. How do we know the date? It is because on one of the platforms in the holy center and capital of the Olmec world, a place called Aventa, we were able to date the stone head because they were rooted in a wooden platform where the Americans worshipped, and we got this dating of 948 to 680 BC. Now, several people have wondered what kind of Africans these were. Who were these outsiders? These were largely Egypto-Nubian types. At least that type was in command. Because what we do find in the evidence is that not merely the presence of this physical type, which is African, but the presence of cultural elements, which we will talk about in this program, which are clearly of Egypto-Nubian origin. And the question arises, why do we include Egypt among classical African civilizations? There is now absolutely no doubt that the ancient Egyptian civilization was overwhelmingly African. They have found the kingdom of Ta-Seti in the Nile Valley, where all the major elements, political and religious elements, spring out of the south of Egypt, spring out of the Nubian world, at Custal in Nubia, where we have about a dozen black kings reigning before the first Egyptian dynasty. Even the hieroglyphs, the writing system of the Egyptians, we find it have their roots in the Sudan, so that as the Africans move up from Nubia, they go into Egypt, so that we find the Africans not only in the evening of Egyptian civilization, but in its very dawn. And we find them also in the noon dynasties. This is very important because it's important to understand that the Egyptian thing, the Egyptian miracle, was not only to touch Europe, not only to touch Asia, but was to stretch out to America as well.
The different points for this picture. Go right ahead. These other two sites in Mexico, this is the best example of the cultural rites that take place in the ceremonial center. That's why they usually brothels, lakes, and circus in Mexico in the ancient times. Typical separate construction. Most of the buildings that we can
Look at these two ones over here.
At the beginning of this museum, I was made the information about from the picture, from where they got at the face. Then when we was passing in the other house, you saw those pictures when they found the faces. This is one of the face more beautiful. You can see the lips, the nose, the eyes. This is completely negroid face, and the weight of this face is 25 tons. We're wondering how they carry in that time, from where they carry these rocks, because it's solid. This head they bring from 134 kilometers far from here. Yes.
So it hasn't been moved since?
No.
Was that stone quarried where they found it? Or how far did they have to bring the quarry stone?
They say from 100 kilometers far. They call basalt. Basalt.
Is it one solid piece?
It is one solid piece. From 25 tons.
What is the relationship between this head and the African presence in the New World?
Well, they showing it to you the exactly origin, Negroid, the basic origin for these peoples.
Why do you think they made, they would carve a Negroid head? What would be the significance of that?
To show when these people was arrived to this continent. They tried to demonstrate when they arrived to America. And that was before Christ. About 1200 years BC was the time when they made these faces.
Were these heads looked at as gods, as priests?
Priest.
They were priests.
Priest.
So then the African present here was one of priesthood or what?
Priest.
It was one of priesthood.
Yes.
Are there any other heads this size for the other races of people?
No, this is the most principal.
Dr. Van Sertima, can you make a comment on this? I was asking him the significance of this in terms of the importance in the society of these heads, and he was saying that these were represented priest class.
Yes, this is the priest king class, because it would appear that these people were among the ruling elite of the Olmec. And these heads were revered. In fact, on one of them you have a flat top and you have an altar where people worshipped. And there is another one in which you have a sort of eustachian tube that runs from the ear through the mouth, so that the priest could stand at the back of the head and talk to the people. It was a kind of oracular thing, you know, the sort of oracle. This is one of the great heads. And one of the things that you should note too, which many people do not note, is the way that thing falls along the ear. And also note the markings, the way it is cut, the way it is eroded on top, because the top of the helmet is also very important to note. The things right on the brow, the way these are formed, because this is the way in which even on top, I don't know how we can get on top there, but there's something quite interesting on the very top of the head. There are certain striations on the top of the head that are also significant. Pay close attention to everything that is said tonight, and that you should prepare yourself to ask questions about the many troubling problems that beset prehistoric America. It is not really prehistoric, it is merely pre-Spanish, but anything that is pre-European is considered to be prehistoric. It is the really critical missing pages of history, both for America and for Africa. And what I want to do tonight, apart from touching on what we have seen within the last day or two at Mitla and at Monte Alban, what I would like to do is to go on to make a summary of what we have achieved, what we have seen, what we have witnessed in the last week in Mexico. We began in von Wuthenau's studio. Make no mistake, there is no studio in the world where you will find such a collection of African physical types in ancient America. Many of you have not had the opportunity to examine closely at leisure all the pieces in that collection. It is a priceless collection, and many of you have raised the question which must be pursued: what will happen when von Wuthenau, who is now 84, dies? What will happen to a collection which is of tremendous significance for us blacks throughout the Third World? Because the likelihood is, as has happened in previous centuries, the likelihood is that all of these marvelous pieces which we have seen, and which we have not yet had time to photograph completely and to preserve, may disappear. Von Wuthenau has, in addition to these little sculptures, he has a catalogue of everything he has. Brilliant photographs taken by several professionals over the years.
He is apparently the director of the dancing group. And this is a man, and his features are Totonac. They are not Negroid, but they paint them with chapapote, so it is a warrior who is black. That is also an atavismo, because they knew that the Olmecs were black.
You're saying that the Olmec people themselves were black?
No, but this one certainly was black. You see, you can't see. And here is the proof for it. It's one of the best proofs I have. This is a figure made that is between the Olmecan period and the Totonacan period, transition period. And this is an Olmec sculpture, and to be black, they covered it with tar. You see, it's a stone head, but it's covered with this tar. So not only the features and the thick lips come out primitive, but it is made black. This piece was put on the cover of Revista in Mexico in March, and shows you that another colossal Olmec head was found in Mexico, which has not been, in my opinion, I don't know where it is, it's never exhibited. I wonder if they really have excavated it. Of course, you see these, there is the item that the people in Tabasco, Tabasco is one of the provinces here, I mean one of the states, the state, just as Louisiana is a state. And the people in Tabasco don't want it to disappear from their place to Mexico City. And there are frictions between the Instituto de Antropología and the state, you see. And that's why I don't know if they've done in the state something about it. In any case, it has not been shown up here in Mexico City. But it is 100% Negroid features, and I wish we could get it out and get some.
The choice of archaeological sites to link all that we have seen together as a single piece. This is one of the most difficult things to do in Mexico. There's a vast amount of confusion, even among the guides who are supposed to have mastered the material in their own area. There's a vast amount of confusion about dates, about the occupation of sites, about the nature of influences, about what the various things we have seen mean. Some of these things cannot yet be explained. Some of these things people can only guess at. But what we are certain of, what we are absolutely certain of, is that the Olmec civilization, which is the mother of all American civilizations, is not a single-stranded civilization. It does not belong to one race. It does not belong to what we conceive of as the Native American who came across the Bering Straits. There obviously were other influences, and among those influences was the African, specifically the Egypto-Nubian of the Mediterranean. When we look in von Wuthenau's studio, we see quite a number of heads, most of them pre-classic. By pre-classic is meant periods between, say, about 1000 BC going right down to about 600 BC. This is a significant phase in Olmec civilization. There are several phases of the Olmec. I must deal with phases now, and those of you who are taking notes, please note, because you can get very confused when you see the Olmec appearing in other places in later centuries and becoming mixed up with other peoples. This is some of the things that lead to confusion. We must understand that in the capitals of the Olmec world, in the Olmec morning or the morning of that Olmec world, you have people coming into the site, occupying these sites as early as 1200 BC at La Venta, the holy capital, as early as 1500 BC at San Lorenzo. Those dates have nothing to do with the actual sculptures, the actual monuments, etc. People walk into a site and start to occupy it because they find there is land there, they can plow the fields, they can grow crops, they can eat, etc. They don't just walk in today and tomorrow they start building colossal sculptures and massive ceremonial platforms and pyramids, etc. So when people come into a site, has nothing to do with when the flowering, the high point, the climax of the civilization occurs. The Olmecs came into their sites pretty early as 1500 BC at San Lorenzo, as early as 1200 BC at La Venta. You must look carefully at this map and see the diamond points. Those are the capitals. And those diamond points show you where the Olmec first made their major settlements. Now it is as early as 1858 that Mexicans became aware of these sites. Remember that just like in Egypt, a great civilization flourished and then died, and then people forgot all about it. The pyramids lay under the sand, the Sphinx lay under the sand. Something stood there like enigmatic witnesses of a glorious past. But many people continued to live for centuries without recovering the majesty of that civilization, without being able to go back to their roots. This is what happened in many of the great cities of the Americas. That for a long time, for centuries, a shadow fell upon this world. Something very unusual seemed to happen somewhere around 8900. Some people put it slightly later, but something very unusual happened in America. It may have been some kind of cataclysm, it may have been an epidemic, it may have been the upheaval, some revolution in which the elite was overthrown and many of the marvelous statues and many of the marvelous platforms were abandoned. We do not know exactly what happened. It was suggested by Victor Damas at Palenque that there was an epidemic of cholera and that could account for the disappearance of people. And that may be a plausible explanation for the disappearance of some of the people from the Mayan sites. But when we come to the Olmec morning, which I want to dwell upon because it affects everything, when Michael Coe and others speak of the Olmec as the mother of American civilization, they are really stating the whole thing in a sentence. It really is. Because in the Olmec morning, on that great platform at La Venta, we find quite a number of things that is to affect the civilization centuries afterwards. But let me come back to 1858. 1858 was the discovery at Tres Zapotes of a stone head. Now this is the stone head. This is the first head to be discovered. Now look closely at this head. When the Mexicans saw this head, when their scholars saw this head, scholars like Orozco Ibarra, Jose Melgar, etc., they were absolutely convinced that there were Africans in America at some ancient time. Why were they convinced? They were convinced by two things. By the African physiognomy, the dome of the forehead, the the cut of the nose, the jaw, the mouth, etc., but also by something which has never been mentioned in the archaeology for some odd reason. And that is, at the back of the stone head there was hair, detailed Ethiopian type hair. No Native American has hair like that. And if that was presented in the archaeology, all this nonsense about babies and jaguars, I have never seen a jaguar with hair like that. And I've never seen a baby with a face like that. People had to find explanations for things they found embarrassing. It is similar to the discovery of the great civilization of Ta-Seti, the kingdom rather of Ta-Seti in the Nile Valley, which precedes the Egyptian. The man who found the Ta-Seti Keat seal never said a word about it. He died without saying anything. And it was left to Bruce Williams, who many of us will hear in Atlanta in September. It was left to Bruce Williams, his student, to take it out to the back rooms of the University of Chicago Oriental Institute and present it to the world. They said the reason why they delayed so long is because it took 15 years to put the pieces together. Without all those pieces, the stoneware vessels, etc., the pottery that was found, the stone incense burner at the site of Ta-Seti at Kustal, the site of Kustal, did not need putting together. It was intact from the very beginning. What needed to be put together were their heads. And that was not put together until the head who had a right to put it together died. Thank God. It is absolutely important for us to take a very serious view of this, because we find again and again and again that you have a deliberate effort to wipe out the evidence, to hide it, to explain it away. Why is it that this photograph, even now, I am not permitted to use that until 1985, because it involves a whole series of things. But why is it that this head is not among the heads at Villa Hermosa, is not among the heads in the National Geographic or the Smithsonian or any traveling circus of Olmec heads? It is hidden at Tuxtla, where nobody goes. It's very important to note that that was the first head found, and it had a profound effect, although it was the only thing found at that time that indicated an African influence. It was left to the expeditions of 1938 and 1939, expeditions carried out jointly by the Smithsonian Institute, the University of California, and the National Geographic, before they found more of these stone heads. They recovered the one at Tres Zapotes, and then they went on the next year in 1939. They went on to La Venta, and then they found 4 of these stone heads. They also found, and many of you have noted this in the museum at Villa Hermosa, at La Venta Park, you have noted the plan of the city. I want you to look at that plan carefully. There is the first pyramid in America. There is the first step pyramid. There are the arms of the village. And on those arms stand the great stone heads facing the Atlantic Ocean. This is in the Gulf of Mexico. This is at the point which on the edge of the Gulf of Mexico where you find the terminus of the Atlantic currents from Africa. Because the currents from Africa take you to northeastern South America, into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico, swinging towards Florida. And then if you are lucky, if you learn as the Africans were later to learn, perhaps not at this period, you can find a circular current that takes you back towards Europe and Africa. Here at La Venta, they began to see a distinctive art style. Here at La Venta, they began to see something in the faces of the monuments, something in the traits, the cultural traits of the Olmec that was to leave its stamp on later civilizations like the Maya, out in Palenque, out in Monte Alban, out in Mitla, even in the evening, the twilight of the gods at Teotihuacan, out at Tatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, in the Monte Alban phase, all of these are branches coming out of the mother culture, the Olmec. And there's something very distinctive. Here, for the first time at Levanta, are the pyramids. Here, for the very first time, is found the sarcophagus, like in Egypt. Here, for the very first time, are monumental stelae and sculptures of colossal proportions. Here, for the very first time, are the great priest-kings. Here, for the very first time, are enormous ceremonial temples and altars built to the gods. Some things must be said about the stone heads which you must note. There is one of them that has a tube running from the ear out of the mouth, which was featured as an oracle, and it has a flat top which functioned as an altar. This is very important because it is that kind of oracular thing that was found in Egypto-Nubian the period. In order for the priest-kings of the Egyptians to hold the world together, which was being torn apart. The Bible describes Egypt at that time like, it describes the great factions and frictions in Egypt at that time. They speak of it as some sort of a torn nation. And in order to pull it together, they had to find once again the power of religion. Religion is responsible for the extraordinary vitality that built the temples and the pyramids and the great tombs of both Egypt and America. Note that. People do not do those extraordinary things. Only giants could do those things. Man becomes a giant when he develops a peculiar kind of focus, when there's a crystallization of his psychic energy. In civilizations that are highly fragmented, that have lost all their certitudes and cannot find again any kind of certitude and focus and power, the tremendous capacity to have the consciousness to operate as a giant is lost. Only giants can build those things. It has nothing to do with size, because the American is small in size. It has nothing to do with machines, because the Egyptian machines were crude compared to the machines we have today. It has to do with a peculiar kind of consciousness which made it possible for one to do things so monumental that even we now, with our great machines, cannot attempt to do what the Africans did. It is so extraordinary that just a few years ago, the American government sent out a team to study how the Egyptians moved heavy objects across the sand. And in spite of all of our technology, when one of the great nuclear things with nuclear reactors were being moved across the deserts of the desert at Gary, they used the identical method the ancient Egyptians used. This is the high technology of the 20th century, looking for a method that was the most practical and efficient method for moving a heavy object across the sands. So you're not dealing here with primitives, in spite of the ancient nature, in spite of the time, the prehistoric time of these cultures and civilizations. You're dealing with highly sophisticated people, a state of mind, a consciousness that made it possible for this extraordinary leap to occur. And the peculiar thing about the Olmec is that that leap occurs with all the Egyptian elements in it. It had its own native elements. It had its jaguar. The jaguar is not Egyptian. Nobody in Egypt or Nubia has a jaguar that they worship. There's a little cat cult in Nubia which I noted, but it's not equivalent at all to the great jaguar which prowled the swamps of the Olmec. Why then suddenly they start with things which are duplicated nowhere else in the world in such a complex, in such a combination, in such an arbitrary combination? The stelae with the hieroglyphs, the monumental sculpture, the sarcophagus, the pyramids, the step and the true pyramid, and all of these elements, even including, as I have shown, the bird and the serpent on the crown of the Egyptians and the Olmec, and all of the monarchic traits, a whole series of monarchic traits that distinguish royalty in the Olmec world and in the Egyptian world. Clearly, we have evidence of some kind of body of people who came into the Olmec world at that time. And there is a reason for this, because people have asked, okay, fine. All right, people can cross the Atlantic, fine. You have proven they have boats, fine. But why did they come here? The Egyptians have no business in the Atlantic, which is true. The Egyptians have no business in the Atlantic. The Atlantic is very, very far from Egypt. And Egyptian ships have no right in the Atlantic circa 800 BC. The reason why they are in the Atlantic at all, in the North Atlantic, is because of an unusual situation that is occurring in the Mediterranean at that point in time. It is very important, therefore, not only to study what was happening in Mesoamerica, but to study what was happening at that point in time in Egypt and Nubia. What you have is a war going on between Africa and Asia. The Asiatics are attacking everyone in the Mediterranean. They have smashed the Hittites. They have taken iron smelting process from the Hittites. They have smashed the Phoenicians. They've made vassals of the Phoenicians who have always been servants of the Egyptians and the Nubians. 50% of the Egypto-Nubian navies are Phoenician. These are people who Sheikh Anta Diop claims were once black, who, like the Arabs who were once totally black in Saudi Arabia, became mixed with Asiatics, and you get this what you call the Semitic type. So that you have a mixed type Phoenician, which it gets black again as it enters North Africa and begins to intermingle once again with black people, until by the time of Hannibal, the Phoenician or Punic type is African. This type is restless up and down the Mediterranean. It has its cities at Tyre and Sidon, its great ports, but it's restlessly moving up and down the Mediterranean. And because the Asiatics block the seaports to the Indian Ocean, block the seaports to the Pacific, and we do have evidence of the Egyptians in the Pacific. We have Egyptian script found in Hawaii. These guys are ranging far out. Nothing stops the Egyptian. Wherever you go, you find him. I have found him in Spain. They have Egyptian villages in Spain, where Barry Fell has shown the cartouches of the Libyan kings around 1000 BC are found at Almunecar, Spain. And that runs right through the Spanish mention in their early chronicles that Taharqa, the Nubian general who is later to become the king of Nubia and Egypt, enters Spain with a garrison, so that the Africans are already in Europe. They're invading. They come in with a garrison into Spain, and then they retreat back because they have their own problems at home. So that we have evidence of movements in the direction west of the Mediterranean towards Africa, towards that part of Africa. And more fleets were driven, both military as well as commercial fleets were driven west of the Mediterranean, because tin was needed for the bronze armies, because this was the late Bronze Age. Copper was needed in Cyprus, tin was needed. They went right up into the British Isles and the North Atlantic searching for tin. And around 600 BC we have the Phoenicians going from Ezion, Geber, and going right down and coming right across Africa, right round Africa, right back into the Mediterranean. The Europeans did not go into the Atlantic because the Europeans were terrified of the Atlantic. The Europeans spoke of the Straits of Gibraltar as if there were monsters in the sea. They did not attempt any movement in that area. But the Phoenicians did, and they were very much tied up, as I say, with African navies. That is the reason why many of the great heads have military helmets. Not all of them do, but they're distinguished by military helmets. They are a warrior dynasty because this is a period of war. For nearly 200 years, the world is in a state of war, as we are. Since the 1930s right up to the 1980s, every major army in the world has been ready to fight. We are in that state in which both the Africans and the Asiatics were. We cannot relinquish that state in this century until there actually is a war, which God forbid. But we cannot relinquish that state. All armies are armed to the teeth in the 20th century world. Regardless of whether you go down into Latin America, whether you go into the Caribbean, whether you go into Africa, whether you go to Israel, whether you go into Russia, whether you go through Eastern Europe, every army on earth now is armed to the teeth, ready and waiting for the conflagration, which, pray God, may never come. But that was the state of the world, where therefore a warrior dynasty appears with the great helmets. The warrior dynasty appears among the Olmec, carrying all of these elements. You find that apart from the stone heads which we have seen, we see cultural traits which I have mentioned, and then we go on to see, as I have also mentioned, that when the Olmec move out of Levanta and they send parts of their elite out at Tlatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, and at Monte Alban, when they study the skeletal evidence right in this territory at Monte Alban, when they go to the graves in this very part of Mexico, in Oaxaca, when they go to the graves of Monte Alban and they look at the ruling class, not the common people have nothing to do with it. The common people are Zapotec, later they're Mixtec, etc. But the ruling class, when they go into the graveyards, 4.5% of the ruling class here at Monte Alban is African. As much as 13.5% at Tlatilco is African. They're not in the common graves, and you can tell because side by side with the native, you're finding a different nose bridge, which remains in skeletal evidence. There's a ridge, there is a nasal index, there is a brow ridge, there are structures of the jaw, there are lengths of the arm. The African arm is different from the Asiatic arm. The lengths, the proportions of the body are different. You find not only skulls, but extended skeletons for study at Tlatilco. And Wierzyński, making allowance for all the blending and mixing of things, still comes out with the conservative estimate of 13.5. We even have graves where you have an African male lying beside a Native American female, indicating that you're having mixings and meltings into different kind of population in some places. And when the Olmecs stretched out, when we went to Teotihuacan, that is the evening, that is quite late. Teotihuacan is around the birth of Christ. This is long after the morning of the Olmec. But there again you see the Olmec. You see the jaguar at Teotihuacan. And you see the jaguar undergoing a strange transition where the plume serpent is becoming the powerful thing in Mexico, which it was in Egypt. In America, the United States, the stars and stripes is our great emblem. In Egypt, it was the plume serpent. In Mexico, it is the plume serpent. Even today, the plume serpent is the stars and stripes of Mexico as it was the stars and stripes of ancient Egypt. Can all this be coincidence? Here at Teotihuacan, here they're building this enormous pyramid, and here all the major principles of the Egyptian pyramid are in evidence. The base is identical. Some people had said it was 1 meter off, but now they find that the meter mistake is what they calculate for error in the reconstruction of the site. Because all those sites, that pyramid was buried under the ground. They did not see it. Many of these things that we're seeing today were not visible in Mexico 30 years ago or 40 years ago. People only started digging those things up out under the earth. This is all standing here looking at the Mexican. They had to find those things again. They found some levels and then they had to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. The story is still largely untold. Victor Damas has pointed out at Palenque, which was called Palquin, that they have 400 temples in the jungles. They haven't started digging yet. They don't have the money. And as you know, with archaeologists, they have their political reasons for digging. Look at Levanta. That's the most important site. Nobody can go to Levanta unless he is an archaeologist sent out by the government. The oil fields are there. They don't allow anybody to come into Levanta. That's on the big shroud. They're doing a lot of excavation. They're finding things. Not a word about what they're finding. We go to Palenque. Palenque is only partly dug up. You see the great tomb and temple. They say it's the only burial found in a pyramid. That is not true. It is the only complete man found in a tomb at the bottom of a pyramid in America. But there mentioned many pyramids in the Americas in which you have urns, one or two sarcophagi, skeletons, all sorts of things found in the hollow of the pyramids. So that it is evidence that they were not only used as temples but as tombs. People have said that there is a distinction to be drawn between the American pyramids and the Egyptian pyramids. That American pyramids are stepped, whereas the Egyptian pyramids are conical. That American pyramids are used only as temples, whereas the Egyptian pyramids are used as tombs. This is not true. The Egyptians began building the step pyramid, which you find at Levanta. When the great black genius Imhotep began building pyramids, he did not build a conical pyramid, he built a step pyramid. There are many step pyramids, not very many, but they're still surviving out of the 60 pyramids that survived, the 60 major pyramids in a complex in Egypt or Nubia. There are several of them that are step pyramids, just like in America. Then the Egyptians started filling in the steps so that when you x-ray some of the pyramids, you can still see the steps, although you don't see it with the naked eye. If you x-ray some of them, you can see the steps because the step is built at the core, because it more easily solves the problem of the ratio of run to rise in the building of that enormous thing. It's called the second of the pyramid in mathematics. So that it makes it easier to build a conical pyramid by putting the steps and then filling it up. It is true that as an idea or a concept moves from one continent to another, regardless of the nature of the influence, however profound, since natives are building it, not Africans, and Africans couldn't build Teotihuacan. Africans influenced the building. To build Teotihuacan must have taken more than 1 million people. There weren't 1 million Africans in America. So that you have native labor, that is people who are living here are building, but the ideas, the engineering, even before they started to build, these guys worked it out like Washington, D.C. They have grid patterns, they have quadrants, they plan the whole city even before they start to put down the first brick. Obviously, you're not dealing with guys who had never entered urban worlds before, because there was no urban complex in all America. Levanta was a great ceremonial city, yes, but real urban life begins at Teotihuacan. So here are these peasants going to sit down one day and say, let us build a city and let us work out all the structures exactly as the city could be worked out so that all of these lines are drawn in a certain way. That is exactly what happened. Only an elite who had the intimacy and familiarity with such structures could actually sit down and plan it out before they even start to lift the first brick. So what we're dealing with is conceptual diffusion, the diffusion of ideas, the diffusion of certain kinds of ideas from people who have been working in this for a long time. We're not talking about Africans building the pyramid. Consequently, therefore, when you see the pyramid in America, you see a different configuration. Superficially, it is different. But it has all, Teotihuacan has all 3 functions that the Egyptian pyramid has. It is a temple, it is a tomb, They have found skeletons inside of the rooms at Teotihuacan, and they haven't dug all of Teotihuacan up yet. There's still hidden temples, hidden passages, inside of Teotihuacan, and it functions as a geodetic marker. That base is not an accident. To build that base, you have to know all the astronomical knowledge Egyptians knew. You have to know the circumference of the earth. You have to know all the units of measurement which came out of the sky, the study of the sky, because we did not make the inch. The Africans did not make the inch by accident. They didn't get up one morning and somebody says, look, let me take my little finger, this is an inch. They didn't build a second of time by accident. The second of time was worked out by the relationship of the sun in its movement across the earth, the rotation on its axis, the rotation of the earth on its axis, all of those things. Those are astronomical things. You cannot have units of measurement without astronomy. Mathematics and astronomy are related, just like geometry is related to the problems they solved in the inundation of the Nile. So all of these things were carried over. Why are they using units of measurement the Egyptians are using? Why, when you go to some of the burials, you find the like in Egypt, you have canopic jars in the north, south, east, and west, and they have 4 distinct colors to mark the cardinal points. The Chinese have distinct colors to mark the cardinal points. They're not like the Egyptian. They are not like the Egyptian. No Asiatic color scheme marking the cardinal points are like the Egyptian. But the early Mexicans are doing it exactly like the Egyptian. How did they arrive at that color scheme? And later on they change it. But at that point of time of contact, they are using the identical color scheme of the 4 cardinal points. They came across the Bering Strait. They're Proto-Asiatic. Why are they not using Asiatic color scheme? Obviously an inference has come in. They have calendars. The Mexicans have more calendars than anybody else. Why, in addition to the 3 other calendars they had, they introduced a 4th calendar, which is Egyptian, with the identical 365.25. They have their own counts, they've worked out their own native mathematics. Why then are they taking this into their system? All of these things have to be explained. Why at El Villajón in the Olmec world, in the heart of the Olmec world, there is paper found made from wood pulp. Nowhere on earth is paper made from wood pulp except among the Egyptians at this point in time. Why are they moving enormous stones which they never moved before from vast quarries, using the same method of breaking stone and linking it together, using the same methods of moving the stone as the Egyptians, bringing it down the swamps? Why is their agriculture identical as on the Nile? They're dealing with the same flood problems. Why they're responding in exactly the same way? They have the same hydraulic system of agriculture. You go down in Peru, which is touched by this, you see the terraced agriculture like in Egypt. Why are they doing all of these things? All their kings are carrying these things. They have the plumed serpent motif. They have the great earrings under their ears. They have their beards as an index of rank and royalty. They have the purple, the use of purple. Yesterday, for example, I caught our guide, Hector, saying that these things were painted red. I said, are you sure you mean red? He said, yes. I said, well, tell me what makes the red. What do they use to make red? He says, cochineal. I said, that's not red. Cochineal is the equivalent in the Mediterranean of the murex shell purple. Cochineal makes purple. All the temples in America, wherever they paint purple. They even painted the stone heads purple. Medinel Zenel found the patch of purple on one of the stone heads and found that the weathering of time, the erosion of the years, have taken the purple off the stone heads. That's the color they use in Egypt. That's the color they use in painting, when the main color used in painting temples is purple, because purple is emblematic of the power of the gods. And the reason why the Egyptians struck on that was by a peculiar, arbitrary phenomenon, that the murex shell, before it reached its final fixed purple, went through a series of tints, which were like that of the Nile in flood. Now, most of you are city people who think that water is colorless or crystal. Water is not. This is only one kind of water. There is red water, there is blue water, there is green water, there is yellow water, there is brown water, there is silver water, there is crystal water, there is black water. All of these types of things, if you lived on rivers as I did, or you lived on the Nile as the Egyptians did, you will find the water goes through many color changes. In fact, after a thunderstorm or a lightning storm, every color on earth, every color of the rainbow is on the water. And if you were accustomed, just like people who live among cattle, every cattle has a different color and marking. So that if you're accustomed your eye to cattle, you know that this is Jimmy and this is Johnny, etc. You don't mix the two things. You can tell one cattle from the other. We can't, because we are not cattle people. And most of us can't tell water color from another water color, because you're not water people. You don't live on rivers. And it is because of this that they were able to make a connection between the color scheme of the fluid in the murex shell before it hit purple with the color scheme of the Nile in flood. And because it seemed identical to them, barring a tint or two, they concluded that the color purple was sacred, because the Nile is sacred. That is why they worshipped it, and that is why common people could not use purple. I told you, for example, of the case of Margaret Handke, who wrote a monograph recently on purple, in which she showed that purple became so important in the Mediterranean. Every European pope, every European king has a bit of purple taken from the Egyptians. They then took up purple. The Phoenicians ran up and down the Mediterranean with Tyrian purple. They destroyed all the ports that had the murex shell until the murex shell was exhausted. And some people say that the Phoenicians came over here with the Africans searching for purple. Cochineal, which is American, nowhere on earth is cochineal found. It has been found stamped on caves in North Africa. It doesn't belong to Africa. Barry Fell and his colleagues found cochineal, and it's been analyzed and examined, and they found it on some caves in North Africa. And the cost of purple was so great that 1 ell or yard of purple could be sold for nearly $1 million at a certain point in time. Only kings could buy purple. It was not the common people. All of these are things that seem to link up the old world with the new. The Olmec then go on, not only touching Teotihuacan, they seem to go on to touch other places. We saw Mitla yesterday. Mitla does not have very much to offer us, because Mitla is almost razed to the ground. You saw the savagery with which the Spanish struck Mitla, so that our friend could tell us that 70% of the population were destroyed by the Europeans. 70% were destroyed by the Europeans within a matter of 50 years. And you find their temples razed to the ground. And I raised with him the question of something, the question which intrigues us is that there is a secret passageway at Mitla which has not been found since the 16th century, which was found by some of the Dominican priests, where they found an enormous burial, and they closed it up, and it was never found again. There are lots of secrets at Mitla, but there again you find Olmec elite coming in, and then the Zapotecan and other people operating at Mitla. At Monte Alban, we have something very extraordinary occurring. Monte Alban seems to be evidence of an Olmec elite which landed in the place, and as building began in new ceremonial centers, they were sacrificed. They were overthrown, it seems, by the people, the Zapotec, the people who were in that area. What evidence do we have that these are not dancers? Because at first they said they were dancers, and recently they started this nonsense about hospital, that how these are sick people, that's why they look so strange. You note those people. First of all, their eyes are closed. They have a distorted pose and posture, and they're in a strange state, and their loins have been cut out in some cases. You can actually see the castration occurring. Now, I do not know of any sickness that causes people's testicles to fall out, because that is what they're presenting as a new theory now. This is a hospital at Monte Alban. That is why you have these figures. Do you know, we only saw a few of them, 140 of those types have been found at Monte Alban. And they indicate this extraordinary sacrifice that was made of ruling types. And for the first time, note, they said that at La Venta, we were not dealing with real people, we were dealing with babies and jaguars. Now they say at Monte Alban, these people have Olmecoid features. How could they have Olmecoid features when they're not? There is no such thing as Olmecoid features, because they say that the reason why these people have these peculiar kinds of faces at La Venta and those places is not because they're real people looking like that, but because they're representing the baby type or they're representing the jaguar type. Now they say they have Olmecoid features. What are Olmecoid features? The Afro-Asiatic, the strange face that begins in the Olmec world that touches Monte Alban. There is the refold. Now that is not a happy note on which to end. Obviously, all great civilizations reach a certain point when they're either invaded from outside, they're struck by some tremendous cataclysm, or they become arrogant like the Aztec in later days, or the Europeans as they are becoming now, or have been for quite a while, but they're becoming more and more arrogant to a point where they may bring about, they may generate within their system a revolt that makes it impossible for them to operate with the kind of certitude with which they operate now. Most of you are filled with a sense of hopelessness when you think of the European giant, the tremendous shadow that he's thrown over the world. But let me tell you that changes have already begun to occur in the 20th century. When I was a boy, one of the things that was told to me repeatedly, in which I believed, is that the sun would never set on the British Empire. There was absolutely no way when I was growing up that anyone could be mad enough to imagine that Africa or the Caribbean would become independent. Now, I'm not saying they're independent, it's a paper independence, but it is a step in that direction. There is a measure of independence and movement away from the metropolitan power. It seemed utterly impossible for such a thing to occur in the world. The imperialist powers of France and England and Germany were so powerful that we did not for a moment believe that anything could happen. But there lay at the heart of the system certain contradictions that eventually exploded, so that the European himself, without the help of the African, began to destroy himself. After the war in Europe, it was impossible for European powers to maintain their hold in Africa and the Caribbean. Riots broke out everywhere. And the more riots that broke out in Africa, the more riots broke out elsewhere. I remember the only time I heard of anything about Africans that made me feel proud and that made me feel that I could identify with them was during the Mau Mau rebellion, when the radio, which we listened to as if it were the Bible, the BBC, said that the British Army was closing in on an African who was the right-hand man to Kenyatta. I can't remember his name now, but he, Dedan Kimathi ran 40 miles on his toes to escape the pincer movement of the whole British Army in Kenya and jumped away from them. That was the first time in my life that I heard of an African different from what I had heard of in Tarzan. That is the first time I began to think that perhaps we were dealing with something else other than what I had been told. It was just a flicker. It was to come later, for example, when books started suddenly to arrive from Russia in English about the revolutions in Africa, and they tried to seize these books, but they couldn't find them. We passed them on fast. So the tide and the movement began and could not be stopped, because suddenly, with almost a religious fervor, note, religious fervor, peoples all over the world began to become conscious of themselves as having the power to change things. That was all. They did not have guns, they did not have bombs. Everything was against them, but they had a new moral force. A new moral force that came out of a contact not as profound as ours today, but a contact, however flickering, however faint, of another kind of history, of another kind of person. Suddenly, as if what had been buried for centuries in history began to resurrect itself, creating a new sense of person. I was talking today with someone, and this is something that has been raised constantly.